God is in relationship with us and God is sticking with it. So when we awaken to that realization that no matter where we go, no matter what we believe, no matter what we do, God has decided to be in covenantal, deep relationship and love with us, we come home. This is the crazy mystery that we don't have to go running down God and convincing God to be part of our lives, that God made that decision way longer before we got here, that was going to be the way that God operated in all of creation. And so when we awaken to that, we start to learn not to reach for it, but to rest in it.
Hello, and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Eric Chakowski. I'm one of the worship directors here at First United Methodist Church Richardson. And with me this week, coming back from last week's episode, is Josh Fitzpatrick, one of our associate pastors. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks. It's good to be here. I'm excited for today's interview.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Well, today is Ash Wednesday, and that marks the beginning in the traditional calendar of the church of the season of Lent. We have 3 services today here at the church. So if you have not attended an Ash Wednesday service, feel free to visit our website, fumcr.com. For some of those times. We'd love to have you, or find somewhere else to experience that service. It's a really impactful time in the church and an impactful service to participate in. So I encourage you to do that. Okay, so Josh, I have to ask the question. Today's Ash Wednesday marks the beginning of Lent, as I've mentioned. Are you giving anything up for Lent this year?
You know, I know it's Ash Wednesday and I should have my mind made up, but the thing I've been toying with and I need to decide, I'll probably have to start a day late because I haven't completely sold into it, is giving up notifications on my phone. I am mildly addicted to the little red dots that pop up on my phone screen, and I'll want to take some time to say, I don't need to check those as soon as they show up.
I was going to say, I'm addicted to clearing them.
Right. It's like it's like whack-a-mole, right? They pop up. I just want to smack them out of the way and get rid of them.
It puts something on my to-do list, and I just
right.
have to get to it quick. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great one. Well, we have a great interview today in Danielle Shroyer. Danielle is a theologian, spiritual director, and a variety of other things, and has written a few books that we'll get into a little bit as well. But we are so excited to have a conversation today with Danielle Shroyer. We are here today with Danielle Shroyer. Danielle is a theologian, author, spiritual director, and just all-around incredible individual. We're so excited to talk with you today, Danielle. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So can you give our listeners just a little bit of context about you and your life, and maybe tell us a little bit about what has led you to this point in your career?
Sure. Well, that is a long and winding story. The quick version is that I got a religion degree at Baylor, and then I went to Princeton and got an MDiv degree and served in a couple different capacities before I came back to Texas to pastor a church called Journey here. I was there for a little over 8 years, and that was great. It's an independent, emerging church, and so it was a really good fit for kind of my whole life up to then. I was very involved in the emerging church movement, the Emergent Village organization, and so that was a really good fit. And then I stepped down a handful of years ago to write full-time, and so I wrote 2 books kind of back-to-back and have spent the last few years writing and speaking, and now I'm doing spiritual direction, so that's kind of where I am now.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Can you expand a little more on your role with Journey? What type of church it was when you got there and what your role was?
Yeah, so I actually was at Journey when I was interning as a seminary student, and it just so happened that I was able to add Journey sort of into my internship. I actually worked at SMU as the assistant chaplain for a year, and during that summer as I was on-ramping, I met the people that were going to start Journey, and they said, do you want to come be part of our leadership team? It was a friend of a friend that I knew from University Baptist Church in Waco that I was very involved in. So I hopped on their leadership team and realized, oh, this is exactly the ministry that I want to do in life. And so I served on the leadership team there, and I was able to practice preaching there, and I led a small group. We had a theology pub before it became like a thing that everybody did, and I was part of that. It was great. And so then when I was in New Jersey, they had called me and asked me to put my name in to be the pastor. And so I was hired for that and came back and served in that way for 8 years.
Now, what does an emerging church like
What is that?
Journey,
What
does
that?
it look like?
Well, it looks all kinds of different ways. When I was there, Mostly it's about the level of interaction, perhaps. It's small, intentionally communal. I definitely didn't preach except for what I jokingly would call the high holy days. So I was like, it's Pentecost, sit down. I have things to tell you because Pentecost is my favorite. And we would definitely not have discussion on Ash Wednesday because that's not a real discussion kind of thing. But most of the time, we would have discussions. It would be much more conversation than sermon. And everyone's input was really valuable and valid to what the community did in that space. And then we always had some kind of response that would make it more than just talking. So sometimes that would mean making a prayer bead necklace, or sometimes that would mean walking a labyrinth we constructed in the middle of the space, or we would do mandala coloring, or we would come up with all of these different prayer stations, something to sort of embody our faith in a way that made it feel more tangible. And then we also tried to figure out ways to make that seem practical, like what are you going to do this week to embody the stuff that we just talked about? So it's a little more interactive, and yeah, it was fun.
I think that's a component of worship that so often we either dismiss or don't put creative energy into. So that's so great to hear that you guys really were intentional about trying to create different sorts of experiences that maybe were sort of unexpected,
Yes.
but also might encourage folks to experience God in a new way.
Yes, and we always tried to figure out something that would push just enough to make us maybe see God or experience God in a different way, because a lot of people that came were maybe a little burned out on church by the time they got to us, and we're trying to sort of reconfigure that relationship. So we were trying to come at it from a different angle, but also deepen those things. And so the discipleship factor of that in those practices was really important for us.
That's excellent. So I want to get into your books, and specifically your most recent book. It's called The Original Blessing, Putting Sin in Its Rightful Place. Sin is this topic that, at least in the Methodist Church, I don't know that we talk a lot about. Maybe some churches do in our denomination, but there's a lot of disagreement about what constitutes sin, what sin is, how sin manifests in our lives, what happens when we sin and when we don't sin. Can you unpack a little bit your belief around sin, or maybe original sin, and what that looks like?
Sure. So we'll start with sin, and then we'll talk about original sin. So for me, I define sin as disconnection. So original blessing is this declaration that we are innately connected to God and that we're designed for a relationship with God, and that nothing changed about that after Genesis 3. It's just simply a continuation of the practice of us figuring out how to be in healthy and wise relationship with God and with each other. And so for me, sin is always an act of disconnection. So some people have said, well, gosh, if you're going to get rid of original sin, doesn't that mean that you're discounting sin? And I say, well, no, I actually think that what you'll notice is that you'll have to call more things sinful than you maybe did before, because every single decision that you make, every choice that you make is tied up in the interconnection that we have with everybody and everything around us. And so when we become responsible and mindful of those connections, then we have to actually really up our ante about the way that we try to intentionally live our lives in the best way possible to be of benefit, so that those decisions and choices are life-giving and not death-giving. So original sin, I've noticed, this book came out 2 years ago, and I've traveled a lot and talked to a lot of people about it, and it seems like no one really understands what original sin is. I've had to have conversations where they're like, well, my denomination doesn't say that, and I have to say, actually, yeah, it does. I had to go and look back at the stuff, and if you may not say that in your church on Sunday morning, but if you look at your doctrine that your denomination holds, all of them have this statement that there is something about our human nature that is flawed and sinful. And that happened in Genesis 3, that there was this inner change that was ruined, right, in the moment that that fruit was eaten. And that ever since then, we have all been born with this flawed sin nature. And that left to our own devices, original sin says that we will always choose evil over the good. So original blessing says instead that we are born not with a sin nature, but a human nature. So we're not born evil or perfect. We're born human, and that we simply, in Genesis 3, learn that we have the capacity for both good and evil. And so our task at that point is to live as best we can, balancing the knowledge of those two things and trying to choose wisely. And that's actually our task. Like the Bible even shows that that's part of the great task of being human, is figuring out how our choices can be seen as wise. So that switch from sin nature to human nature doesn't discount sin. Like I said, I think it actually makes sin more appropriate and more applicable in our lives. But we definitely see ourselves differently, I think.
Would you also say that it gives us a more optimistic view of God?
Yes.
The reason I ask that question is particularly within a Wesleyan tradition. I think your book lines up well with our theology because we have an optimistic view of humanity.
Yeah.
And if we're truly created in the image of God, viewing the potential of humanity as opposed to the flawedness, or it seems to line up with what you're saying.
Yes, indeed. And I get frustrated because everyone's okay with the image of God language. And then as soon as you get past Genesis 3, they're like, but caveat, no, the image of God was never said to have gone anywhere. And so you can definitely hear in Wesleyan tradition that there's that emphasis on the image of God being intact and being present in ways that seem more holistic, right, than in maybe some other places. And so that's certainly in line with what Original Blessing is trying to say. And yeah, you see God as certainly benevolent, which, I mean, if we don't get that from Scripture, I don't know what else we're supposed to get. This idea that of all the entities and forces in the world, God is the most consistent, trustworthy, steadfast, loving, forgiving, And so that really is the only foundation worth living on and living in. And everything else is just a danger zone of this combination of good and evil, right? And so I think Original Blessing sends us really closely to God in that benevolence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious, what do you say to the people who say that this is a new idea? I know in your book you say that for about 4 centuries the idea of original sin wasn't even in existence. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yes. So the term original blessing, I want to say, was coined by Matthew Fox, who's a Catholic priest and theologian. He actually was defrocked by the Catholic Church because of his stance against original sin. That's a story for another day. But anyway, he did coin the phrase original blessing. So that's been around for about 20 years, and I'm hoping that more of us write about it and use it so that it becomes more common parlance. But the idea has been along for way longer than just, 20, 30 years. So you're right. The first 400 years of church history, we had no doctrine of original sin, and we did fine. And I say in the book, this was the most important season of our Christian history because if we didn't make it, we would be sitting here having this podcast. We have a faith that has lived on because people found it compelling for that first 100, 200, 300, 400 years. And I also say in the book that, we have to remember that if we look at the Christian tree, that the Eastern Orthodox branch of that tree has never, even to this day, believed in original sin. And so they've always stuck to this concept of original blessing. There are sections of the Protestant and Catholic and Western side of the tree, like the Celtic Christians, who have never claimed original sin as a thing that they follow. And then if you look broader on the tree of just the 3 Abrahamic religions, you have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And Judaism and Islam also don't adhere to original sin. So when people say, well, gosh, this is foundational, I say, well, no, actually, if you look at the whole entire tree, it's Western Christianity that's not in line with the rest of the orthodoxy of the whole Abrahamic faith. So we're allowed to talk about it in a way that doesn't say it's overly foundational, even if it feels like it for us as American Christians.
Interesting. That's good.
So one of the things that you talk about is the concept of awakening to this blessing. Unpack awakening to the blessing for us a little bit and how we might experience that in our lives.
Yes, so I use the term awakening because part of what we understand in original blessing is that there is something that we already had that we may have forgotten or not realized before. So we don't need to go find it. We don't need to earn it or something. It's already there. We just need to awaken to it. And so awakening to original blessing is acknowledging that God is in relationship with us and God is sticking with it. So when we awaken to that realization that no matter where we go, no matter what we believe, no matter what we do, God has decided to be in covenantal, deep relationship and love with us, we come home. We come home not only to God, but to our own selves in that moment because we realize that we don't have to go seeking God outside. God has already come to us. This is the crazy mystery that we don't have to go running down God and convincing God to be part of our lives, that God made that decision way longer before we got here, that was going to be the way that God operated in all of creation. And so when we awaken to that, we start to learn not to reach for it, but to rest in it. And that's where I think our spiritual sense of maturity and capacity starts to grow, when we really learn to trust that blessing is waiting for us.
And so to come full circle, when we rebel against that in a sinful way, there's that disconnect that you talk about, right?
So I do talk about this in the book and kind of break it down, but we don't actually see the word sin until Genesis 4 in the Cain and Abel story. And that's the story of disconnection. He feels that God doesn't love him the way he wants God to show him love. He feels like he wants more, right? And because he feels that disconnection, which is not actually true, God loves him fully, right? And you can see that because even after he kills his brother, God protects him by putting this mark on his head, which is really a benevolent, gracious thing for God to do, right?
Right.
That's pretty terrible. You murdered your brother. That's the first murder we've got in this story. It's really bad. Things are going off the deep end here, and God responds with this graciousness and kindness and protection, actually, for him. But yeah, it all starts because of disconnection. And I think when we think about our own lives, if we want to name something that's sin, it starts when we start doubting something. Our worth, our validity, our power, like all these things that we start to think, I've got to get a grasp on that. I feel anxious about this, or I'm afraid that I'm going to lose something. Whenever we start that grasping and we lose that connection to this abundance of God, that's when we start messing up.
So we've got these sort of churchy things that we say in the church, right? So draw upon the courage of the Lord. And, sometimes that can be a difficult thing to sort of understand how that applies to our life. But as you talk about, when we have this self-doubt sort of creep in, we find comfort and are able, as you said earlier, to rest in the knowledge that God is pursuing us in spite of our disconnect and will never cease to do so. And so when we are able to find comfort and courage in that, that's where the truth of the gospel really comes alive in our lives.
Yes. And when we settle back in and come back home to ourselves, where God is always waiting for us, that's when we actually can be moved to do the right thing again. That's when we say, oh, because God loves me so much, I can say, I'm so sorry I treated you that way. I take full responsibility for this sin of disconnection that I enacted upon you. We actually become way more responsible for ourselves because we feel that because of the courage and strength of God, we can own up to the places where we've fallen short, and we can do something about it to turn it around because we trust in that stability that God gives us that doesn't come from us getting it right, but comes from God always receiving us well.
My mind is being blown right now. I'm having like a heart strangely warmed experience. Within Wesleyan tradition, we talk about this pursuit of holiness, and some people argue against pursuit or not, but this idea of becoming more and more holy. And historically, that's been something that's been talked about as a list of things that you avoid, right? Like you don't go dancing, you don't go drinking, you don't go playing poker. And the more things you can avoid, the more holy you become. But that seems like that'd be coming out of a language and a framework of the paradigm of original sin. It occurs to me that if you're focusing on original blessing, then the pursuit of holiness is actually coming to terms with the fact that the image of God has never left, that the abundance of God is within you, and that enables you then to be able to wholly love God and others. Man, I'm just having this religious experience right now.
Yeah, it actually, so to use, well, I don't know if these terms are going to make sense, but I like to talk about it sometimes as moving from external motivation to internal motivation, which psychologically speaking, right, you want your kids to do the right thing when you're not in the room. That's the goal of parenting. Like,
Right.
you know that if you look at them, you give them that look and you point at them, that they're probably going to put the cookie down or whatever. But you want to know, are you going to make the decision to put the cookie down when I'm in the other room? You could totally eat it, So that internal motivation is what we are moving towards. So that's what I see holiness as, actually, when Wesley talks about that. I've always thought of that as this movement from don't do this to because I love so-and-so, I'm not going to do this. Or because I value this more, that doesn't make sense in my life. It doesn't have to be even judged. It's just that's not fitting with the way that I'm living at this moment. We don't have to be mean or judgy about it. We just have to realize, well, gosh, that's not fitting with the way that I want my life to go. And I've got to intentionally cultivate this way of being in the world that I value. But the great thing that I love about the Methodists, I grew up quasi-Baptist, and so I love that the Methodists are at least intentional because, and I talk about this at the very beginning of the book, that blessing is and blessing becomes. So there is that second piece that we need to remember if we're going to get the whole story, or else we're just not being honest with ourselves. Because if all we do in life is just go, I'm going to hide in the original blessing of God and just know God loves me, but I'm not going to take responsibility for anything. Are we? Is that actually resting in blessing in a way that actually does that? So the other part of holiness for me is that responsiveness of blessing, which is as we rest in it, we are then sent forth to be a certain kind of people in the world. And we do need to pursue holiness.
It's great to hear you say that because I struggle a lot personally in conversations with folks who are absolutely correct in saying that the places that I'm disconnected from God are covered because God loves me anyway, right? And we know that to be true.
Yes.
But
and
for us to, it's the and. Because for us to truly experience the fullness and richness of the gospel, that and has to be there if we're not truly taking responsibility. We call that repentance in the church, which sometimes has a really negative connotation, but I think is a really healthy and joyful thing when we take part in that wholeheartedly. And then it turns into this cycle that you've sort of referenced where we find a disconnect from God, we take responsibility for it, we hopefully have some sort of convicting, heartwarming moment of transformation, and then are sent out back into the world to, as you said, be a reflection of that, to surely disconnect ourselves again from God and start the cycle over again.
Yes, and it's just endless, right? It's continual. And there are times when we sort of level up and we think, oh, well, I may not do that thing anymore. But then if we wait a few months, we realize we have a new thing that we'll do, So, okay, good, we're moving, but we still have to realize that this is a lifelong pursuit, and that's why it's a journey. That's why it's your whole life seeking wisdom. And you get to the end of the road as a human and say, I tried to do the best I can with the time that I had, knowing that was going to take every day. You're never finished with that work. And I think that's the dangerous thing is I do remember some parts of Baptist life where it was like, you're saved, good to go. You're finished with that work, right? And if you triumphalize that a little bit too much, I think it's letting us off the hook from the fact that we're always supposed to be part of that work, But there is something beautiful about how original blessing lets us enough off the hook to where we don't get stuck in the shame. And I do think that in original sin, well, I don't think I know. As a pastor, I saw it over and over and over again, that this is a doctrine that actually stands in the way of people being good disciples. It is a preventative for people actually stepping into the work that Jesus wants them to do and has called them to do. So when we can at least feel that sense of relief that I don't have to be defined by my worst moment, that doesn't have to be all that I am, then we can be freed to turn into that cycle again where, of course, we're going to disconnect and, of course, we're going to reconnect. And what is it, that thing that Walter Brueggemann says? It's just endless reconciliations. Brueggemann says something like that, like the Bible is just an endless tale of reconciliations.
It seems to me that traditions that emphasize the doctrine of original sin also have an emphasis on the cross, and rightly so, because within that set of theology, the two work hand in hand. Methodists more often emphasize the resurrection over the cross. Why do you think we dwell so much on the cross and stop the story there? And then also in your book, you talk about the cross being a blessing. Would you explain that a bit?
Yes, and certainly I would say the cross is the thing that gets people maybe the most tripped up. First, they think, are you saying that humans are perfect? And I say, oh, goodness, no, keep reading. And then the second thing is, what about the cross? What are we supposed to do with the cross? If it's not supposed to save me from my personal sin so that I feel better, what is it for? I'm not trying to take away the fact that part of what happens at the cross is that Jesus saves us from our sins and we feel better. That's just not the primary or only reason that Jesus died on the cross, and to see it that way is inordinately selfish and debilitating to the work of God in the world. Like, that's offensive to what Jesus did on the cross, personally, I think. So I talk about the cross being a blessing because in so much of what we've done in just religion, right, we've tried to set it up so that it's an if-then world. If I do what God says, then I will get a prize. At the end, I will get to go to heaven. If I am righteous, God will send me a check in the mail.
Transactional relationship.
It is totally transactional. And it can kind of go off the rails in lots of different ways. Like the prosperity gospel is one example of that. Like, if you're faithful, God will heal your cancer. And then, like, what does that say when God doesn't heal someone's cancer? Or if you're faithful, you will be blessed financially. And what does that say to the millions and millions of poor people in the world about how God loves them? So this if-then relationship that we set up over and over again creatively throughout religion, Jesus dies to that on the cross because he did everything right. So he should have been living on the high hog in a big fat castle with a lot of servants, having milk and honey, and having zero problems, like nothing but just a walking rose garden for that guy because he did it all exactly right. And what happened instead is that he found himself oppressed by the powers that did not like the fact that he was trying to speak out against them and how they were wielding that power. And he died for it. So what does it say when not only that God dies, but that someone who did human life absolutely perfectly dies? And I think at least one aspect of the cross that we've lost is that sense in which Jesus blows up that if-then religion that we try to create for ourselves. And in so doing, saves us from that because we think we want to live like that, but we don't because that's exhausting, That continual putting a coin in and flipping it for blessing and needing that gumball to come out. I mean, that would be exhausting if that's the way that God set the world up. And so thankfully, God doesn't and hasn't and won't, right?
Right. I love that.
So can we talk about a little bit of your other work as well? You've done some videos for the Work of the People. One of the videos that you have on there, you explain that the role of the church is to proclaim in our living the story of God. And then actually you were a speaker here at our annual conference in North Texas in 2016, and you mentioned that we are called to bear witness in a world that has stopped watching. So what are some ways that you think that we bear witness to the story of God in our living, especially in society right now?
Yeah, that concept of bearing witness in a world that stopped watching is, it continues to be really important for me to remember because I think for so long, partly because of my personality, but partly because I was sort of around this triumphal feeling about faith, it was that I was going to make this big difference and it was going to be this big something. And like, if it wasn't big, you go big or go home, And I think what I've learned now is that when people aren't watching and you don't get the benefit of the doubt because you aren't like the biggest Super Bowl show ever, you really can only be a person of integrity. You can only do faithful work day in and day out. And that most of the time that's going to be really boring and unsexy and not that interesting and nothing anybody's going to write the Dallas Morning News to say that you need a profile on this, It's really unhurried and often unlauded work. And so for us in the church, I think that's what we have to sort of get over is this idea that, first of all, that everybody's going to come and think that we're this big thing because that's over, Most of the time they don't think we're that big of a thing anymore. We're in Dallas. We get out of that a little bit. But for the most part, nobody cares, right? But they will care if we just show up and try to be good neighbors. And we just show up and care for people that are in our midst. And we just show up and try to be people of integrity that actually think about the way that we live our lives in ways that will affect other people. So if we take care of our community and our city and our nation and our global society, then I think that's the thing that will allow people to, when they do see us, notice something that's worth watching. But it's really tough to tell the American church to sort of die to its sense of needing that big triumphal presence.
One of the things that our senior pastor says often, and probably partially inspired by your words from annual conference a few years ago, was if this church ceased to exist, would our neighbors notice? Would our community notice? Would our schools notice? Are we making the world a better place by living out the gospel of Jesus? And if we're not doing that, then surely we're missing a huge, if not the largest component of it.
Right. Yes. And that's just often work that doesn't get noticed that much, or, you hear these stories of someone who passed away and it's like someone at the funeral says, he sent me $10 every week, or some small thing that you didn't know. Like, I didn't know that he came over to this person's house and kept this widow company, or nobody ever knew of this thing that this person did their whole life that was just a basic rhythm of their life and part of their faith. And that often isn't even known until the end, right? And so, I think the beauty of and simplicity of just that everyday faithfulness is something that we can do. And we can do collectively in ways that do really matter. I mean, we can show up in schools and make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter if you have 10,000 in worship.
Yes.
For us to show up in schools and make a difference.
Yeah. But gosh, if you have 10,000 in worship, show up in the school and make a big difference.
That's right.
And then be cool if nobody writes it up, be completely cool about it because you didn't do it for that, right? We didn't do it for the applause. We did it for the fact that we trust that our work has integrity within it. And that's its own reward.
Now, some of your newer work includes spiritual direction and a website that you've recently launched called beasoulninja.com. Can you tell us a little bit about the Soul Ninja project and where you're heading with that?
Yes. So a few years ago, I sort of had hopped into some Eastern things, obviously, when studying Original Blessing and reading up on some of those things and reading up on the way that different religions understood sin. And I was really taken with the Buddhist concept of basic human goodness, which is just one of the main precepts. If you're Buddhist, you just say, hey, you have what you need to be a good human. The end. If you're a terrible person, if you've made a million mistakes, what you need to do is strip things down to get back to that basic human goodness that you have. And so I found a real affinity for my own work in Original Blessing as a Christian in that space. And so I started reading, and these things called the paramitas kept coming up. And so they're a set of either 6 or 10 based on whichever school of Buddhism you're looking at. But they're basically the Buddhist version of the fruits of the Spirit.
Okay.
And so they would say, it would come up in these readings, these books, and it would say the paramita of patience. And I knew that I was thinking that in Christian terms. And I thought, well, how do I get the nuance of I know what I mean as a Christian when I say patience, but what do they mean? I think the Buddha means something different. So I thought, well, the only way that I can learn that is if I practice it. So starting in September, I started practicing one paramita a month. And the Buddha says basically that these are the 10 virtues that make you an awakened being in the world, like a bodhisattva, somebody who lives and serves others in a way that's beneficial and good. And so it's been really great because there are so many cool overlaps with my own faith. And there are ways that I've seen my own faith in a broader and more beautiful way because of the way that Buddhists describe these shared virtues. So that's been a really fun project.
When someone visits your website, what are they looking for and what do you provide or what are you hoping to get out of it?
Yeah, so usually on Mondays and Fridays, I write reflections or sort of supportive helps for people that are doing the Paramita Project with me or just kind of looking in. So I talk about, this month, I'm practicing wisdom. So today's post is about being mindful of our media diets and how that's an act of wisdom to think about, what is actually coming into our minds and how is that forming us into the people that we are. And then usually on Wednesdays, I do ninja wisdom.
Okay.
So the other side of this is I went on a walk with my dogs and this phrase soul ninja came to me. And it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, I'm supposed to listen to this. I have no idea what that means. So I went home and I scribbled it down and I was like, I know literally zero about the ninja. So I'm a real big nerd and I decided just to read all the things. So I think I've read all the English translated books about the ninja in the English language. Pretty much read them all. I can tell you which ones are good and which ones are a little tragedy. But it's still a huge mystery to me. It's really hard to nail down what the ninja were. But what I learned was that there was this really lovely tradition of spiritual practice. I mean, it's a spiritual discipline to be a ninja, I mean, not the assassin, Western version or whatever, but
Sure.
there was this deeply meditative practice. And then, of course, I learned all about the martial arts and that the martial arts actually started because they were trying to meditate, and it was very noticeable that everybody was being antsy. So it was like, well, what can we do to get in our bodies so that we can be better meditators? And that's how martial arts started.
Wow.
Isn't that cool?
That is
Wow.
cool.
So yeah, now I take Taekwondo and
Really?
yeah.
That's too cool.
Yeah, I was like, how else can I learn more about that? I think I should just practice it. So yeah, so the ninja wisdom is kind of little things that I've gleaned about being a centered human being based on martial arts philosophy and ninja history and other super random things that you may or may not be remotely interested in.
No, I think
But it's super fun for me.
Okay, now talk a little bit about your spiritual direction.
Yeah.
Are you open to still taking clients as
Yes.
a spiritual director, and what does that look like?
Yes, I do take clients. So spiritual direction is a multiple thousand-year-old tradition. Most tend to be sort of in the Episcopal line nowadays, and my mentor is Episcopal as well. It started actually just monks and nuns were able to have this. So it was a way of having a mentor that would sit down and say, how is your soul? How is your life with God? How are your spiritual practices? And having someone really be a companion and listener for them. But the cool thing is that now it's really for anyone. So if someone's going through a faith shift, which, is something that as a pastor, I saw lots of people go through and sort of shepherded a lot of people through their kind of deconstruction phases. Or if somebody's just in a position of trying to discern what's next for them and they have a sense of vocation or calling that's in transition and they're trying to find somebody to help them discern spiritually what that might look like. Or if someone just says, I don't know, I have a sense that I just need to be more grounded and I haven't found spiritual practices that help me do that. Spiritual direction is a way that we sit down together and listen for kind of the work of the Spirit that's happening in somebody, and we try to tease that out. So it's awesome. It's really holy work, and I'm super excited I get to do it.
And do you just do that locally here in Dallas or on a national level as well?
I do it nationally and internationally. I have a couple in the UK, actually, and we just meet over Skype, so that's really fun. So if someone's international or national, not in Dallas, we meet over Skype, and then people locally, I meet them in person, which is fun, too.
And if someone's interested in that, they would go to DanielleShroyer.com?
Yes.
Okay.
Great. Danielle, my mind is going a million directions right now, and sometime we'll have to have you back to go down some of these other roads because I'm fascinated by the work that you have done, the work that you're currently doing, and sort of all of the different places that seem to intersect in that work that you're doing. We're so appreciative that you came today to spend some time with us. We have one more question that we ask every guest that comes on the podcast, and the question is this. At this point in your life, what's one thing that you wish somebody would have told you?
That's a really good question. Are you guys Enneagram people?
We are.
Okay. So I'm an Enneagram 8, which everybody hates Enneagram 8s. I totally get it.
Oh, I don't think that's true.
Oh, I think most people.
I'll defend
and I get
Enneagram
it.
8s
I
to
get
the
it.
end of the day.
Well,
No,
that's very nice.
Yep.
And so people are always like recoil in fear when I say that. And I should say I'm not a normal Enneagram 8, but I do just wake up with an insane amount of energy every day. And so what I really always say all the time is like, if I could get in a time machine and go back to myself at like 13, 14 and say, listen, this is going to be good for you. You're going to need to work out real hard every day, and you're going to need to meditate every day. Then you wouldn't believe how much more awesome the energy is going to be for you. And you'll just figure out how to focus that like fire hydrant in the correct direction. Oh man, that would have been so great to know that at 14.
So to give you some comfort, hopefully, we've had Joey Shuey on this podcast, also an Enneagram 8. And her answer was very similar to that question, that she wishes she would have known at an earlier age how great it was going to be for her to be an Enneagram 8.
Yeah.
Very similar answer.
Yes.
So that's great. Yeah.
It's super helpful. Daily hard workouts and, some meditative quiet time.
Yeah. Excellent.
Fix that right up.
Danielle, thank you so much. This has been a joy to have you. And again, I just need to dive into some of your work even more. And for anyone who is interested in Danielle's work, Josh, give us those URLs one more time.
Sure. So the one is DanielleShroyer.com, and the other is beasoulninja.com.
Danielle Shroyer, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
One of the things that struck me most about our conversation with Danielle was her commentary around this transactional relationship that so often we feel like we have with God. It's a lie that we tell ourselves, if I do this, then this will happen to me. And to be able to understand the nature of God in a different way and God's hopes for our relationship with God through Jesus Christ reframes our understanding of who God is and what the truth of the gospel is and how it's made manifest in our lives.
And to that end, we leave you with a passage from Danielle's book. When we claim a sin nature, we depart the green pastures and still waters of blessing for the dry desert chasm of separation. We forfeit walking with our shepherd and walk across his back to get our salvation ticket validated instead. But Jesus doesn't want us to walk across him. He wants us to walk with him. The gospel is not a solution to our sin problem. It's an invitation to participate in the blessing and life of God. And that is fantastic news. It's headline news. It's compelling. It's a compelling elevator pitch. Original blessing is one of the most beautiful gifts Christianity has to offer the world. While there's nothing original about sin, original blessing is truly revolutionary. In a world too often bent on retribution, original blessing is the healing balm of God's faithful and unending love.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of More Than Sunday. If you like the podcast, please feel free to share it, go online and leave a comment, or give us a rating so that others might hear about us. We have a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure you also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at fumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Danielle Shroyer for joining us this week, and make sure you tune in next Wednesday when we have a conversation with Dr. Thomas J. Ord. Have a great week.